Hey, so Passover and poetry. Let's start with a midrash. Midrash says something like this: that Pharaoh made four decrees, four gezerot against the Jewish people. It lists them. The last one is that the Jews were no longer allowed to have their Sabbath day. Apparently, they had. Moses made some agreement with Paro, according to this narrative, and they had a Sabbath day. It's pretty much a conventional narrative within the Midrash. So, and this was especially distressing to the people of Israel because on the Sabbath, they would read. They had Megillot, they had scrolls. The Midrash is not really clear on what the scrolls were. Some of the later commentators say that it is they were reading stories from the Bible, reading Bible stories. They're reading stories of the flood. They're reading about their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, and Rivka. And that's how they would spend their afternoons. And that was like the last straw. They couldn't read anymore. Now, so that's interesting that we say that really one of the things that held the Jewish people together, there were other things that kept their names, etc., whatever. But one of the things that kept them together is they read books. Now, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, I studied with his grandson in Kollel for a long time. Rav Yaakov, and this is interesting, the way in which really this rabbi in his persona as great rabbi is really just being a poet. So he has a different way of learning. The way of learning is like this, that what they read was Psalm 92. Psalm 92 is Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat. This is the song that we sing on Shabbat. And that psalm talks about the apparent triumph of evil and the way in which, in the world that we live, evil seems to dominate. But at the end, the tzaddik, the tzaddik in the end, he will blossom. So even though, this is the psalm, even though we live in a world that is corrupt and disappointing and seems sometimes to be without any hope whatsoever, and this in the story makes sense for the people of Israel. They're not feeling great, right? So they read this psalm. According to Rav Yaakov, many say that this first psalm was written by Adam Rishon, by Adam in the Garden of Eden, right before the Sabbath day. That's what I had known. But Rav Yaakov says, no, this was the song that Moses gave to them. Now, first, before going back to just the reading of it, it is very interesting the way in which Midrash involves readers constructing vastly different ideas of what actually happened. The yeshiva world has gone off, the ultra-Orthodox world has gone off in the direction of believing in, what really happened. And that's a function of the yeshiva world really in the 19th century, having to respond to the triumph of science, the putting down of the humanities. So any kind of claims of truth that were current in those days, especially this is relevant to the Soloveitchik family, to Brisk, we will show the logicians were even more logical than they are. And that mode of learning has kind of taken over the yeshiva world, such that when you get to Midrash and yeshiva, they say, weiter, we're not big enough to understand this. Or you have somebody who tries to understand it, and it's always very abstract and mystical. When in fact, all you have to do in order to understand Midrash is to learn how to read. And Rav Yaakov, there's something about being in yeshiva, and quite apart from what I just said, that when people retell these different perspectives, there is not really a claim, and I'm just talking about in the most conversational sense. Nobody believes, as we're talking about it, that this actually happened. I mean, maybe they do, but if they believe it actually happened, they're also accommodating 14 different other ways of learning. So Rav Yaakov is coming, and he's like a modern poet, right? He says, no, it wasn't Adam Rishon, it was Moshe Rabbeinu. It was Moses. And Moses wrote this Psalm of Consolation. So the Marzu, he's the Achron, the reader who says they were reading Bible stories. So this goes a step further. Not only were they reading Bible stories, but they were reading, heresy alert, they're basically reading Paradise Lost. Why do I say they were reading Paradise Lost? Because Paradise Lost is just that. It's the first theodicy. A theodicy is, for those of you who haven't been in my courses 400 times, is the justification of the justification of God to man, justifying God's ways to man. Why do God's ways need to be justified? Because things suck, right? Things sucked for people in Mitzrayim. They sucked for people in Egypt, and they thought. And the Medrash really goes into this in ways in which the Torah doesn't, that everybody kind of loses faith, including in the Midrash, including a little bit Moses, which is very, very interesting. But here, what they're reading on the Sabbath, so first of all, reading is good. Second of all, what they're reading on the Sabbath is they're reading works that console them and allow them to believe in a future even when their sin is not to be one. Now, it's interesting for us because Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, is definitive of us, for us as Jews, because that is a story completed. God made his promise and he fulfilled his promise. So the Midrash is going back into the kind of the mindset of the people groaning in Egypt, of even Moses saying to God, like, why, implicitly, why are people suffering like this? And we go back into that mindset and we feel that suffering. We feel that sense of not knowing. And Moses said this is why they read poetry on Shabbat. They read poetry on Shabbat because poetry is the way that we can think about the future. Part 1 of our Poetry and Passover series.